So I'm Cory. I'm an artist, a painter, a professor here at Samford. I'm also the board chairman of an organization called SIVA, Christians in the Visual Arts. It's a national organization. It's ecumenical, so artists of all kind of denominational worship traditions, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Anglican, Baptist. I mean, we kind of all come together. We don't always agree on theology, but we create a hospitable space to have some of those conversations and to really just support artists, and then also point them to Christ. I'm also a former elder. I used to go to Shades Valley Community Church here in Homewood, and I was an elder there for 4 years. And so even though I'm not a pastor, I've kind of seen the behind-the-scenes version of church and what that can be. And then I'm currently a member of a PCA church down in Helena. And so I have this kind of weird inside-outside experience of having interacted with a lot of artists, interacting with church leaders, and even through my work with SIVA, church leaders from other churches kind of around the country. And many of us are asking some of the same questions that you guys are asking and looking at. And so for me, this is a bit personal in the sense that I've always been an artist, and when I got out of graduate school, I started teaching at a small Christian college outside of Chicago, and my family and I went to a church there. And one of the first conversations I had, like the first or second week I was there, one of the elders came up and introduced himself and was real friendly, and he asked me what I did. And I said, "Oh, I'm an artist." And he looked at me and said, "Oh, so you're a narcissist?" And I was just like, wait, what? How did you go from artist to and in his mind, all artists were narcissists, and art had no real healthy place in the church because he just couldn't make that connection. And believe it or not, we actually stayed at that church for a year or two, and over time, he never changed his point of view. And one of the reasons why I think we ended up moving on is just as an artist, I never felt welcome in that congregation. So that's a negative experience that I had. I also had a positive experience where we were at an EFCA church in Chicago, down in the city, very vibrant community, artistic community in that church, embraced artists, brought artists in from the outside. They gave me an opportunity to do lots of different kind of art projects. And it really had a deep impact on just, again, me as an artist and the ability to use my gifts in the church, or even have the option to use my gifts in the church, and have the community, whether they understood what I was doing or not, be like, yeah, that's cool, man. Let's see more of that, right? And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with this session, I thought, man, it would be really great if we could just have a dialogue or conversation to help pastors and church leaders kind of understand artists in their congregation, but then at the same time, as artists, maybe begin to understand a little bit more about ourselves and how we fit into those congregations. And so my inspiration for the title, if you're a parent, you might have encountered this book, Shepherding a Child's Heart by Ted Tripp, who's Paul Tripp's, I think, brother, by the way. And it's a really, really great book. My wife and I read it when we first had our kids, because it focuses really on the heart of children and parenting children from the heart, as opposed to just monitoring behavior and stuff. And so I think for a lot of both pastors and artists, it really is about a heart issue and just making sure that we get our hearts kind of aligned. And so I'm at the very beginning of this kind of, in my mind, I've been thinking about it for a long time, but at the very beginning of kind of a research project that who knows, what will happen. And so I would love to get your guys' input on just your experiences, both pastoring artists and as artists in the church. And so definitely, invite you to keep this conversation going even after today. But my main kind of objectives today is, one, I want to just recognize the blessings and challenges that pastoring artists in your church can be, and we'll talk a little bit about just some of those blessings and challenges. And having worked with lots of artists, and having been in leadership positions and trying to plan events with artists, I can understand some of both points of view. Equipping artists to engage in the life and ministry of the church, but then also supporting the work of artists in the church. And so I kind of separated those two things because we have to equip our artists spiritually mature in a mature way, helping them understand how to work, within specific parameters that the church, that I think all beyond even just churches, but all institutions often will have. But then also supporting those artists as part of that process and helping them, find ways to engage in the church, and then to encourage both artists and church leaders in regards to not only that relationship, but recognizing the benefits of what can happen when artists get engaged in your church. And so the verse that always kind of comes to mind is, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, and helping artists really understand that in a really kind of a healthy way. So if you all, either you're artists or artists, and you know that artists really care deeply about things. And if you're familiar at all with any of the Enneagram stuff, I mean, I've looked at it a little bit. Any artists, creatives tend to be the kind of the number 4 type. This isn't going to be about Enneagram and number 4, but that's been really helpful for me. I'm actually not a 4, but I know a lot of 4s. And artists can be really, really frustrating to be around and to work with at times. And Enneagram has just really helped me specifically my colleagues here at Samford, just kind of understand them, and it's just helped our relationship. So I'd encourage you, again, you don't need to do really a deep dive, but just Google Enneagram 4 and read some of the descriptions. And for, I think, a lot, not all, again, I'm not a 4, but a lot of artists fall into that category, and it might be a little bit of a light bulb, like, oh, that's why they're that way, right? But one of the things that I've learned about artists is they're constantly looking for identity and establishing their identity. And a lot of times artists will establish that identity either in their work or some project they're working on. In more of a negative way, they establish their identity in more worldly things, like creating a brand and having YouTube followers, right? And as pastors and church leaders, what we want to do is make sure that they're establishing their identity in Christ. And so I think that's a really big kind of thing to keep in mind is with your artist is they're constantly, and again, when I say things like I'm just speaking kind of big picture. Every person is going to be different, but a lot of the times they're really just searching for that identity and groundedness in who they actually are. And so one of the first things that I would just encourage you guys to do is just continue to point artists towards Christ in regards to that identity and who God has made them to be. And this gets to some of what you were saying, right, is helping artists understand that these gifts are not a bad thing. These are a good thing. They have a place in our churches. They have a place as Christian artists in our culture, and learning to understand and utilize those can be a really, really, I think, healthy and important thing. Okay, so I want to kind of go through each of my objectives here and just talk a little bit about and give some commentary on why I think these are important. And so again, this recognizing artists and recognizing the blessings and challenges of pastoring artists in your church. And again, if you've worked with artists, you know that we can be a little bit of a unique bunch, and that there are both good things and bad things that can happen. And I just brainstormed. This is not an all-inclusive list by any means, but I wrote down last week what are blessings of working with artists, and some of the things that I thought of in regards to the situations that I've been in, or I've worked with friends of mine who are artists. And when I speak about artists, again, I'm speaking both in terms of as visual artists, which is most of my experience, but also musicians, dancers, actors, poets. And so I don't want you guys just to think, that painters are only this way. I think that it's broad enough that it's going to kind of cover all of these different things, or all of those different kind of art forms. And so as artists, we're a lot of fun. We typically, a lot of the time, can be really joyful and fun to be around. A lot of energy, really enthusiastic about things. If you get an artist excited about something, they're going to be primary cheerleader. They're going to want to talk about it. They're going to want to tell people about it. They're going to want to show people. And so they can be really, really helpful in that sense. Creativity and just looking at things from a different point of view. Artists are very curious and inquisitive. we like to ask a lot of questions. And so when we start asking questions, don't be defensive about it. It's just we're curious. We want to know. If we make suggestions about changing or thinking about things in a different way, again, don't take it personal. It's just as artists, we tend to process and think through things that way. Artists are adventurous. We're willing to take risks. We're willing to do things that a lot of times people won't be comfortable doing. And even something like, changing the colors of the drapes in the sanctuary. Artists are going to be all about that kind of stuff, whereas a lot of times other people aren't, going to be so willing for that change. Artists are passionate. They will get really passionate, especially about specific issues that kind of intersects with their interests. And again, they will be full on cheerleader, talk about it, read about it, want you to talk to you about it, and so again, harness that passion, I think, in a positive way, and it can be really, really helpful for your congregation. Artists typically are pretty self-aware. They kind of get who they are, and they might not always admit it, but they understand what their faults are and where they tend to struggle, and which is good, because there's a lot of times artists, not just artists, but just the general population isn't always super self-aware. Artists are very sensitive and humane. A lot of empathy, for example. Artists have empathy. They can see things from other perspectives. They're going to feel bad about situations or sorry for situations in ways that maybe others in your congregation might not really understand or recognize. And then again, artists are very appreciative of beauty. And I'm not even talking just like aesthetic beauty, but some of what we were talking about even yesterday, like the beauty in suffering, for example. Like artists pay attention to that kind of stuff. And so, again, this is not an inclusive list by any means, but these are some really, really great traits to have in people who are sitting in your pews. Right? Like these are allies who can really come along and help the ministry of the church, bring new kind of vibrancy and passion and enthusiasm into the church in ways that sometimes others either aren't able to do, or it's just a lot harder for them to do. And so, again, artists can be real blessings. Artists can also present a little bit of challenges. And if you know artists, or if you've worked closely with artists, you might have experienced some of these. I've got several examples that I won't get into of just working with artists where I've been disappointed or I've been burned a little bit. And sometimes they don't even realize it, right? Artists can get self-absorbed, especially when they're under deadline or under a lot of stress. And so they tend to kind of close off the world around them and really just focus on the thing that they're working on or that they need to do. And you can be like, hey, I need some help over here. And they're gone. Like you don't even, know what they're doing. And so that can be really, really frustrating, especially if you depend on them for specific things. And so keep that in mind. We can be a little erratic, and I say we because I definitely fall into some of these traits as well. Erratic or absent-minded. I just forget things. Again, I'm thinking about a painting, or not even a painting. I'm thinking about a certain color of paint and how to mix that color. And my wife will be like, hey, where are you at? You forgot to pick up our kid from football practice, And I'm like, oh, sorry, I was forgetting. Yeah. And she's like, she can't even understand that, right? And so again, like I'll just kind of get lost in daydreaming, thinking about stuff that for non-artists might seem really trivial. But for me, especially at the time, it's like, wow, this is really important. I need, And so we can be a bit erratic and absent-minded. We can be a bit aloof in terms of, especially when we get like an idea, or again, that gets back to the positive of that would be like that kind of self-focus, like hyper-focus driven, where we're just focusing on something and just working on it and not paying attention to anything else, not thinking about anything else, not thinking about the ramifications of anything else, and how that might affect other people. And so that can come across as just being kind of aloof or not really caring. Sometimes artists come across as uncaring, and I don't necessarily think that artists are uncaring. They actually care a lot. It's just that they're thinking or they're focused on that specific thing, and it just doesn't intersect with your world at that point. artists can be moody, right? And some days we're like, this is the most amazing thing, and then the next day it's like we're miserable and depressed. I went to school at the Art Institute in Chicago, and which is on the back side of that beautiful museum that's right on the lake there. And my studio was behind the museum, and every day I had to walk through the museum to get to the train to go home. And let me tell you, as an undergraduate, every day you're walking through these like masterpieces. It can be pretty intense and intimidating. And there were some days where I would walk through and be like, Picasso, you've got nothing on me today. I just, in my mind, for whatever reason, in my studio, something worked, and I just thought I was the cream of the crop, And then there were other days, and this was most of the time, if I was going to be honest, where I would walk through and just be like, I'm a fraud. What am I doing here? I'm wasting my time. I'm wasting my money. I'll never be as good as these guys. And so that definitely expect mood swings with artists. And again, don't take it personal. I have a funny, just side note story. My pastor at Shades Valley Community Church, when I first started attending there, for about a year and a half, every time he would see me, he would be like, "Are you okay? Is there's something going on, man?" Because I was always either just thinking or thought, or I would just, like, I wasn't that kind of bubbly, like what he expected. And it's just, there's a lot going on in my mind. And I think artists tend to be that way. I would always like, yeah, I'm fine. Like, because in my mind, I am fine. But to everybody else, I might look like, ooh, stay away from him. Artists are financially challenged. And so part of this is just working with artists who have a really hard time staying on a budget. And so you have to be really clear with them about the parameters of the budget that they have for any kind of projects, because we get excited and enthusiastic and passionate about it, and it's the most important thing in the world to us. And if it costs 10 times what you're giving me, well, that's okay. You'll figure out how to pay for it, because I'm sure not going to think about that, right? And so just as a bit of a side note, and this is where a lot of times, and I've seen a lot of church leaders, pastors, organizations get burned when they're working with artists, is, again, the artist's passion often blows through the boundary of any kind of budget, and then you're left holding the bill going, wait a minute, we didn't agree on, this is a true example, shipping 500 paper airplanes across the country at a cost of $500. Like, that actually happened with an organization I work with. And we're scratching our heads going, like, seriously? And the artist is like, yeah, what's the problem? Like, and we're just, it's like, these are paper airplanes. But anyway, and so, yeah, that's just part of it, is like, artists tend to not think about budgets and finances. And for most of us, math is a foreign language, and so again, just for those of you working with artists, you just have to constantly have conversations with them about expectations and checking in, and even when you have to, and you're gonna have to say no sometimes, and they're not gonna like it, like, they will throw tantrums about that, and you just have to say, like, look, I'm doing the best I can, but here is the limit. And I think just being open and having conversations about that is just really helpful. And then artists, we tend to hold on to past hurt. If we've been burned in the past, we kind of hold on to it, and we'll remember that. And so I know a lot of artists who have been burned by the church in the past and have a hard time reconnecting with churches, just because something that happened 15, 20 years ago, and it might not even be a big dramatic thing. It could be a situation like what that elder at that church told me, like, oh, you're a narcissist, and it just rubs them the wrong way, and then that happened to me 15, 20 years ago, and I still remember it, right? Like, we just hold on to these things, and we just make these, like, well, that's what they think of me, so I'm done with them. And so, again, you just have to be really sensitive about that. And my guess is if, as, again, pastors, as you're engaging with your artists, and there's always this kind of block or wall there's probably a past hurt that has left some scar tissue. And so you just have to be sensitive about figuring out, what that is. And so, again, those are just some of the blessings and challenges of working with artists, and just, I think it's just helpful to name that and recognize it. I think we oftentimes want to think like, oh yeah, every artist is going to be really excited and great to work with, and we are at times, but we can also be really difficult to work with as well. Artists aren't normal. And I think that it's important to recognize that. Notice I didn't say artists are better. I think that's more of a negative, kind of unhealthy view. But just recognizing that we're wired a little bit differently. And we do need a little bit of extra attention. And we are, from time to time, going to need some extra hand-holding and stuff. But that effort will pay off. Again, when artists come to a place of health and spiritual maturity and a recognition that they're part of this wider community, they can be your biggest cheerleaders. They can do some really, really amazing things. But it might take some work and some effort to get there. And so artists, we need support. And so, I just want to encourage, you guys who work in the church to really support your artists. Nancy, your organization does a really great job of this. Support artists who are in the church. And so this is just kind of my list of what, as an artist, like what I'm constantly kind of needing. And so one, I need artists need you guys to care about their work and to actually genuinely care. My pastor came up yesterday and crashed the session that I spoke in. And he didn't have to do that, but he cared enough to drive up, 20 minutes to sit there for an hour and listen to something that he doesn't really totally understand. And he saw my painting that I installed, and it meant the world to me. I mean, that meant a ton that he cared enough to do that. And that, just a small gesture like that, that doesn't mean you have to understand their work. It doesn't mean you have to be able to talk to them about it, especially in terms that you might not be familiar with. But just show that you care goes a long way with artists and just building trust with them. You need to spend time with artists, and that's part of the deal, I think, with caring. Again, it's just being around them when they have art shows or concerts or dance recitals. Invite yourself. Artists love attention, so we're not going to say, oh no, I don't want you to come. And just go and spend time with them. Ask them questions. Artists love it when you ask them questions about their work. We might not be able to answer you, especially as a visual artist. Oftentimes my work and what I'm doing visually is ahead of my thinking, and I might not really be able to explain why I picked that exact color, but I'm happy to talk to you about it. And so just ask them questions. You don't have to pretend that you know about the arts or anything like that. I think just asking and just being in a posture of wanting to learn is really helpful. Clear parameters and expectations, especially when you're working with artists on projects they might be doing in the church. An example is if you ask an artist to put some photographs of theirs up in your church lobby, right? You're going to have to really this again. This is from experience. You have to explain to them, okay, you need to have them framed, and when I hang them, this is what this means, and we have no budget for this, so don't spend any money. Because if you tell an artist, hey, I want to hang your photos in the lobby, they are likely to go have them professionally framed, expect them to be installed with a crane, and then they will send you the bill, okay? And so I think, again, just parameters, expectations, and that could be as simple as hey, let's have a conversation. I just want to hear about what you're thinking you're going to do, and I'm going to tell you whether we can do that or not. You don't have to write out a big, long contract or anything like that, although contracts are helpful. I will just say that. But anyway, yeah, and so my paper airplane analogy, which, again, is a true story, was because the executive director of SIVA, the organization I worked with, asked an artist who lives in California the artist asked if she could do this project where at our conference people made paper airplanes, and she said, sure, sounds great. And in her mind she was thinking, cool, I'll get a ream of paper, people will make paper airplanes. In the artist's mind it was, I also need to ship all of the paper airplanes from before, and of course you're going to cover the cost of this. And so because we weren't clear about the expectations, because honestly, we didn't think we needed to be, but we learned a lesson on that one. We ended up with a $500 FedEx bill because she sent them across the country. So anyway, without telling us, by the way, so they just showed up one day. We were like, wait a minute, what happened? Why are we getting this bill from FedEx? So anyway, yeah, I think just clear parameters and expectations, just setting those kind of boundaries is going to be really helpful for the artists. It's going to help them understand, okay, what can I do and what can't I do? And most artists are going to be cool with it and be like, cool, like now I know what my parameters are and I'm happy to work within them. I mean, that'll be 99% of the time. In fact, they'll probably be thankful because it solves a lot of their questions of like, oh, what do I have to do? But yeah, I've just learned clear parameters and expectations are important. Artists want you to challenge them. They want to be challenged. They want you to ask them questions. They want you to, if you see something that you don't quite understand or might seem a little off, especially theologically, ask them about it. Just be like, hey, what was your thinking there? Hey, where does this connect with like scripture? You know, they like those kind of questions. You do need to be gentle. We are sensitive, and you know, again, I think, you know, you want to keep. As much as, you know, especially as older artists, we get really thick skin about criticism and things like that. But especially, you know, because we're moody and you never know, the wrong comment at the wrong time, even if it's given in love, can definitely wound us. And so, you know, just keep that in mind. You want to be gentle when you challenge them. And so I always, when I talk to artists, especially my students, but I preface it like, hey, would you like to hear some feedback? You know, so then that way they kind of get their radar up and like, okay, and then, you know, then I got a question about this specifically. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And so just, again, little ways of kind of gently challenging them, and artists will typically respond really positively. And actually, whether you agree or not at the end of the day, they'll enjoy the fact that you cared enough to have a conversation with them about it. And that'll actually mean a lot. Artists really need you to celebrate with them when they achieve things. Like they, you know, these are big, it's a big deal for artists. And I'm not just talking about like high level, I had a big gallery show or whatever, but even small things, you know, small things that might not even be public, but you know they finished a project or they submitted a grant application. You know, just submitting the application can be a big deal for a lot of artists. And so just little things like that, celebrate, take them out to coffee, say, hey, let me hear about your project. This is really great. One of the things, though, I do say is don't treat them differently. We are different, but don't treat us differently from the rest of the flock. You know what I'm saying? Like, artists are part of the congregation. We're part of that flock. And what I don't want you guys to do is think, okay, I have the artists over here, and I have the rest of the congregation over here, and so I have to treat them separately. Because what will happen is, and whether this is intentional or not, but I've seen this happen a lot, is the artists will start to think of themselves differently, and oftentimes we'll elevate ourselves, because that's what we tend to do. And the rest of the flock will be like, why are they so special? And so, you know, again, it's this kind of tricky thing of where you need to recognize their gifts, the blessings, the challenges, recognize how they can help the church, but don't treat them as separate. Where I really see this happening is with musicians and music. And a lot of times the musicians are lifted up because a lot of them are up on stage, right? And people see them, they're visible. And so they get a little bit more special treatment. And so don't treat them differently. You know, you're pastoring them very much as it's different. It's a different approach, but the same way you would pastor an accountant, a nurse, someone else like that, teacher in your congregation. And so anyway, that's my kind of, in terms of supporting artists, I think these are really helpful things. In terms of equipping artists, just helping artists understand good theology. Most of us are not theologians. I mean, I admit, like, I'm not a theologian. I didn't go to seminary. I don't even really, just as a small confession, I don't really like to read C.S. Lewis. I get about 5 pages in and then fall asleep. That's because my brain is wired. I mean, I know artists who love those kind of conversations. But again, I need help. I need my pastors and church leaders to help me understand theology and different theological points of view and approaches. And so I will ask a lot of questions of them. When I was an elder, I asked a lot of questions. And I have a really good basic understanding of the Bible and of Scripture and, you know, all of the key kind of important issues and stuff. But just, again, when you start to get in the weeds of theological conversations, there are things that I still don't understand. And so just, I think, helping your artists understand good theology, because again, that theology, whatever it is coming through them, right? It's filtered through them. And as they do public things, whether it's in your congregations, your church buildings, or even just in the community, it is going to come out. And that theology that whatever they've adopted will start to you'll start to be able to see. And if it's not good theology, if it doesn't align with the gospel, it doesn't align with your specific kind of denominational thinking, that could become really problematic, right? And can create issues for you guys. And so, again, just helping them have good theology, helping them learn the Bible. I would say this, I teach at a Christian college. My students don't know the Bible. They just don't. I teach at a Southern Christian college, and my students have no idea. I mentioned, I made a reference a year ago or a year or two ago to Gideon, because I was talking about the fleece, and they just looked at me with blank stares. They had no idea. And so you got to help them learn the Bible. Don't assume, just because they're in your congregation, they're excited, and you say, hey, that'd be awesome if you could do an art piece on this passage of Scripture or whatever. Don't assume that they know it. Don't assume that they know the broader connections throughout Scripture or where it fits within kind of the bigger story of Scripture. Definitely take some time to sit down, have a coffee with them, and just be like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Just want to, what's your understanding of that? Just ask questions, give a little bit of guidance, help them learn the Bible. Help them learn to serve others in the church body. Artists love to be for the most part, we love, even though we have the stereotype of wanting just to kind of go away to our cave and paint or, write songs or whatever, we do love to be around people, especially other artists. But we often get, again, that kind of uber-focused, kind of self-centered, and we'll kind of detach ourselves, and we don't often serve. And so find ways for artists to serve in the church body. And I would say both artistically, but also just as a person, right? Like, hey, we need help with this, whatever, we're having a potluck on Sunday and I need help with someone distributing food. Can you stand there and do that? Just helping them recognize and see the needs of others can be really, really helpful for artists as well. And then again, helping them to use their work to point others to God. I think, like I said yesterday, one of the greatest things that we can do as artists in the church is point others back to God. And we can do this in really creative ways, but we need some help in learning how to do that. And so you guys, especially those of you on the front lines, you can be really, really helpful for this. And so before I get to this last point, I always, again, 1 Corinthians 15:58 comes up in my mind that I think about this idea of, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And working with artists can be frustrating at times. It can be difficult, and it can seem like you're not making any traction. But again, be steadfast. Keep going. I mentioned Francis Elise move a mountain piece, and he moved it 4 inches, which might not seems really insignificant. Like, really? But it was 4 inches, and it's a small amount, but even that small amount can have big kind of ramifications. And so, keep at it. And so, finally, just to encourage both you guys as church leaders, but also as artists, and I have my little asterisk there because when I say artists, I mean spiritually mature and healthy artists. And I think that that's important to recognize that. And I will say, if you have artists in your congregations, we tend to be really eager, and you just don't think they're ready to engage in some way within the worship setting, or small thing like putting up photographs or something. If you don't feel like they're ready, I would not give them the platform or ability to do that until they are ready. And just have a conversation with them about that. Be like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about, what if we waited a little bit? I'd love to talk to you more, and again, help disciple them along to get to that point. Because I have seen spiritually unhealthy, immature artists can really wreak havoc in your congregations, because again, there's a bit of they're public, right? They're putting their work out there, and artists often will want to seem edgy and not quite understand what can happen with that. And so again, you just have to use discernment and wisdom and know your artists really well. But artists who are spiritually mature and healthy, they can really add a lot of depth to the teaching, to the liturgy, to the worship, just to the environment, to the setting, in a really helpful and important way. And so I think that that's something to kind of keep in mind. They can help lead others in new forms of worship, right? I'm specifically thinking about musicians, but dance as well. Maybe not the Baptist church, but they can use those gifts to lead others in new forms of worship. They can inspire your congregation. I'm sure we all kind of feel seasons of just like, man, things are just kind of, in the doldrums a bit. Like, I need a little bit of life, something to spark or ignite my congregation. Artists can really do that for you, and they can really help just inspire and ignite enthusiasm. They can open the doors to the community. Art is a great way to do outreach and to bring others from around the community in, especially communities that aren't quite like your own. You can invite artists from those communities to come in to, whether it's exhibit work or to sing as part of the choir, whatever, create some kind of event where you're putting your artists with those from the outside, especially when you can partner with like-hearted churches who might be in that community, and it can really create bridges of opportunities between those communities, because art's kind of low stakes when you actually think about it, right? Like, if someone gets mad at a photo, I mean, they might be mad at a photo, but they're not gonna, most of the time, a congregant's not going to storm off. Whereas if you bring in, say, a preacher who starts preaching something that doesn't align with your church theologically, now you got a whole bunch of problems, right? And so, again, it's not as high stakes. And so you can really use artists to open doors to your community, to start conversations. I did a project a few years ago called Out of the Depths, which was on the migrant crisis in the Middle East. And a pastor friend of mine here in town connected me with a friend of his who was living and working in Lebanon. And so I made paintings and he made photographs. And we just thought this was going to be kind of a one-night thing in the church basement. And it ended up being like this 5-year project that went to like 7 or 8 different galleries all over the country. And every time I would go and be at the opening, people would come and we would start having conversations about this issue and about the role of Christians and our response to migrants and immigrants and things like that. And it opened up all this conversation that if you're just kind of speaking at it at a cultural or political level, can often get heated really quickly. But when you're talking about it from an artistic level and they're seeing and understanding, and again, in that kind of low stakes environment, it can really make a pretty big impact and difference. And so, the arts can definitely help you host kind of difficult conversations. And so just, be willing to do that as well. So, all right, what about you? We've got about 5 minutes left. I